Well, BookTube, I'm going to time myself. It is 10:03 at night. It is February the 23rd. It is a Thursday here in West Michigan. And I noticed that one video I did, that tag, was 27 minutes long, and I didn't get many hits on it because people thought it was too long. So I'm going to try to keep this video not that long. So right now is 10:03, and I'm going to stop at, let's say 10:15 or 10:20. So what I want to talk about is books. I have some thoughts. Those who've been watching my videos, if you've been watching them, what's the word? You've been watching them over a period of time, see that I get a lot of books. And I have, once in a while when I watch a BookTube video from someone, they'll say, for example, well, I don't know how they can afford all those books. Or the person will say, well, I just get books out of the library. Or they'll join BookTube, and then they'll feel the pressure to go out and buy books just to have something to show in a video or to talk about or to review. Now, for me, most of you don't know me personally, but if you were to know me personally, you would know, especially my wife would know, that I have always bought books, even when we were first married, raising our kids, and we didn't have much money. And to be honest, I want to tell you that it has only been, I say, the last, 15 years that my wife and I have come to a place of peace about me buying so many books. And we've been married 38 years. And I want to be really honest that when our kids were little and they were going through growing up and we were living, and I was always buying books, even though my wife would really get upset at me because I was always buying books. And back then, like I said, one of my videos, Christian books are expensive. And since I have such a wide interest, not only in secular books, but in Christian literature, I was always buying books, always using the charge card or going to a Christian bookstore and buying a lot of books. And then my wife and I would have these arguments. But I think when our kids grew up and they left and went to college, and when I was working, I worked for about 13, 14 years. I didn't make much money. I think I took home probably $16,000 a year. Now, I did put into retirement fund 20% of my paycheck, but of course I had to pay Social Security and all those other things. So I didn't really make much money, but every paycheck I would reward myself by buying some books and CDs. And that's what kept me going. I would work, and then I would think, well, if I do this certain amount of hours, I was making probably take home $6 an hour. And when I first started working, I was hauling eggs off farm trucks. It was all manual labor, very hard physical labor. I always say I was a farmhand, but I worked at an egg processing plant, I worked in this giant cooler, and these trucks would back up, and then you would put these these things to the back of the truck that would able to roll down these huge steel carts of eggs, and then you would put them in order as large or brown eggs or small eggs or extra large, and what farm. There was 4 or 5 different farms, and you had to fill these forms out. And I did that for about 13, 14 years. I also worked some of those years on an egg processing plant, loading eggs into an egg processing plant. And I worked with Latinos and Asians who didn't speak any English. So I never really talked to anybody except my boss over me, who was a great Christian guy. The point is I would comfort myself. I hated the job. I was suicidal at times, super depressed. I hated my job. I just didn't like it. I wanted to stay home. I wanted to read my books. I wanted to write, and I wanted just to be here at home with my wife and my kids, or just be here. I didn't want to be out in the world. I didn't want to work in a factory. I didn't want to work. It was just exhausting, backbreaking work. But what I would do is I think to myself, okay, I'll get a paycheck and I'll go down to the local Christian bookstore and buy me some books. Or on a weekend, if the weather was really nice, I would drive to Grand Rapids and I would go to Erdman's bookstore or Baker Bookhouse or Zonderman's or any of these, and I'd buy myself books to comfort myself. And then I would go downtown to the record store and I'd buy CDs, and that's what I did. And my wife, I did give at least 75% of what I earned to the household, but I always kept a certain amount for books. And sometimes I'd buy too many, and my wife would get upset and blah blah blah. But the point is, I've always bought books. When my wife and I were first dating, that's what we did on our dates. We went to bookstores, and we still do. My wife and I, that's what we do. We either go to the grocery store, or we go out for a meal, or we go to a thrift store, or a used book sale, or to a bookstore in Grand Rapids. I don't like to do anything else. I don't like leaving the house. I like, my wife and I, we do go for walks along the lake, or we go for walks along the lake, or we'll go someplace and have a meal and just hang out. I love being with my wife. I love being with her, but she knows that what I like is going to bookstores, going to used book sales, going to thrift stores, looking for books. And also that's another point, is that I got to a point as a Christian where I have read everything within my theological and Christian tradition. I am a conservative evangelical Calvinist, but socially I'm I grew up in my teenage years, in my early 20s. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was influenced by the counterculture. I was saved in 1970. I was in the Jesus movement with Jesus Freaks, and I've always, like I said, I've always been into Jack Kerouac. I mentioned this book, The Visions of Cody. I've always been, all my Christian life, I've been into the writings of St. John of the Cross, who was a spiritual, what we would call a mystic. I hate the word mystic, because he would consider himself just a spiritual director, a Christian. And I've been influenced for the last 28 years, the Carthusians' spirituality, and The Cloud of Unknowing, and The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. And these are the books that kind of make me odd, and I don't fit within the evangelical Reformed Calvinistic tradition. I'm Jack Kerouac, St. John of the Cross, The Cloud of Unknowing. We don't know who the author of Cloud of Unknowing is. And being a Carthusian spirituality with, late 13th century Mexico City blues. And I've always been into music. Van Morrison, when I was like in seminary and Bible college, I was into Bob Dylan, Van Morrison, Bruce Coburn. And then when I was doing my internship in Houston, Texas, I got into Sonic Youth and the Pixies and Peter Murphy and Uncle Tupelo and people like that. And then when I started working, I started buying all kinds of music. And now I'm into, for many years, I was into indie rock. I was into Americana, or I was into indie pop or slowcore or 80s like The Cure and people like that. And I was into singer-songwriters. I still am, like Ryan Adams and a bunch of others. Now this last year I've gotten into heavy metal, black metal, and death metal. But I've always been into some kind of music. For years I was into folk music. I was into classical music. I was into 60s, classic 60s. And I didn't really get into music in the 80s, except for like some Bruce Springsteen and Van Morrison and people like that. So I've always been into music. I've always been into books. Before I met Carol, I was too poor. I didn't have any money. I worked in Skid Row missions. I lived out in the woods. I had girlfriends who had houses, and I'd stay with them on weekends. Or one time I worked for a 7-Eleven store, and for about 3 or 4 months I had an apartment. That was many years ago. I've been married 38 years, so that's like 41 years ago. But so back in those days, I would go to libraries, like seminary libraries in Berkeley and San Francisco. I had a library card, and I would check out books. I didn't have any money, and if I did have a little money, I would go buy a systematic theology or a Puritan reprint, or somebody would give me a book for a gift, like Thomas Watson, another 17th century Puritan. It's 10:16. I got 4 more minutes on this little book wrap. So that's the point. So to me, you might see a lot of books in my videos, and you see I have a lot of books. Now, the last 10 years since I stopped working in 2007, it took me a couple years to get back into my own inner rhythm. And I won't go into the details. I did teach the adult Sunday school for 10 years, but then I had a spiritual turnabout in my life. I'm no longer really considered orthodox in conservative Calvinistic circles, and it's hard to explain for those who are not into the Reformed faith or Reformed theology. So I can't join any conservative Reformed church because I don't agree with them on the Torah, on infant baptism, and on covenant theology, and on spiritual or pastoral care, or their view of worship and their view of community. So I'm not Arminian, I'm not dispensational, I'm not Pentecostal. I don't believe in contemporary music. I don't like health and wealth kind of gospel, which to me is heretical. So I don't really fit anywhere in the American evangelical world. So what I do is I read the Bible. Like I said, I read things like St. John of the Cross or the Cloud of Unknowing or some Bible commentary or something on New Testament theology or Pauline theology or Old Testament, a book of the Old Testament like on the book of Isaiah or a New Testament book on the Epistle of Hebrews. And I'm always reading and studying the Bible. I have since I've been a Christian 47 years. But now, since I don't teach Sunday school, I haven't been involved in a church because I can't teach in any churches because I'm not Orthodox. So there's nowhere I can use my spiritual gifts of evangelism and teaching. So what I do is I stay home, but I still study like a minister, a gospel minister. I got 1 minute to go. So the point is that if you see all these books, it's just normal for me. To me, I've always had a curiosity for the world. I've always been a student of popular culture, a student of history. That's one thing I want to say. Our middle son, Josiah, is a history teacher. My oldest son, Caleb, he got his master's in political philosophy at Boston College. My daughter was a first grade teacher. My daughter's married to an engineer. Josiah, who is a history teacher, is married to an English teacher. My son Caleb, he didn't go into academia. He has a job I have a hard time explaining, but his wife is a nurse practitioner. And my wife is a professional nurse. So we're all highly educated. I have a bachelor's degree in Christian education and Christian missions. I have a Master Divinity degree. I studied systematic theology and church history and the Bible. And so I've always lived in the world of books. I've always been a student of culture, of history, of music, of art, of literature. I've always been into Jack Kerouac and literary writers like Philip Roth and John Updike and John Irving and Iris Murdoch and Joyce Carol Oates, and it just goes on and on and on. I've always been interested in all kinds of things. And now that I'm not working, now that I'm able to stay at home, I just immerse myself in these worlds. So that's what I wanted to say. This is like wrap number 1. And so I'm not going to say any more because I've talked it's going on 10:21. I just want to share these thoughts. So I show a lot of books, but that's just my life. My life has always been this way. I love books. So until next time, thank you for listening. Thank you for the subscribers. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to share anything. Until next time, bye.